Welcome to Progressivism After Roosevelt, Taft and Wilson, Part 1, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for high school students. First, let's review the progressive era in American history. Progressivism is associated with a time period spanning about 1890 to 1920, although those dates aren't exact. The root word of progressive is of course progress, and that's exactly what progressives wanted to achieve. They wanted to make progress by fixing the problems they saw around them. The Gilded Age that had followed the Civil War had been a time of national expansion and great wealth creation, but for progressives it had also created immorality, inequality, and corruption in all areas of society. So the progressive movement sought solutions for the problems of individuals, cities, and the nation as a whole. Progressivism was never a single unified movement, but was more like a wide umbrella over various reform movements that included Americans of all regions, races, parties, and classes. Some progressives were prohibitionists who wanted to ban alcohol. Others wanted to amend the Constitution to give women suffrage, the right to vote. Some were social reformers who wanted to help the urban poor. Others were political reformers who wanted to end the corrupt political machines that dominated big cities. Some progressives were conservationists who wished to preserve the environment. And still others were trust busters who wanted to break up monopolies. How did they hope to fix these problems? Broadly speaking, progressives believed in using the power of government to achieve the reforms they desired. Government, they believed, could be the ultimate problem solver. In this way, progressivism was a departure from prior American history. In the past, Americans had favored a smaller government that did little but interfered little and cost taxpayers even less. This would change during the progressive era. By its end, the United States would have a larger federal government that would play a much more active role in people's lives and in the life of the nation. Most progressive reforms started at the grassroots or local level before they eventually came to dominate the national politics of the United States. Eventually, progressivism found a president who fully embraced its ideas, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, or TR as he was known, was an accidental president who took office after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. He would serve until 1909. Once in office, Roosevelt proceeded to transform the presidency with his energy and outsized personality. He shifted the nation's focus toward progressive issues, many of which were important to him. Roosevelt used the Sherman Antitrust Act to prosecute trusts, the enormous businesses like steel or railroads that dominated an entire segment of the economy. Roosevelt would prosecute over 40 trusts under the Sherman Act and take on some of America's wealthiest and most powerful men, people like John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. Roosevelt also brought regulation, government control, and oversight to industries as diverse as railroads and meatpacking. His administration passed laws like the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which put the government in charge of inspecting and ensuring the quality of the food, drink, and medicines sold to the American people. Roosevelt loved nature and the great outdoors, and probably his greatest progressive achievements lay in the area of conservation. He set aside 230 million acres of protected public lands, national parks, national forests, and national monuments. But for all the change he brought about, Roosevelt never thought of himself as a radical. Instead, he offered the American people what he called a square deal, a fairer version of the system that already existed, with government leading the way. When Theodore Roosevelt won re-election in 1904, he had pledged to the public that he would retire at the end of that term. It was a promise he would live to regret. In 1908, Roosevelt was only 50 years old. He was still active, popular, and he loved his job. He had served less than 2 full terms, and nothing in the Constitution at that time prevented him from seeking a third term. But TR kept his word and declined to run again, practically hand-picking his fellow Republican William Howard Taft as his chosen successor. Taft had served in Roosevelt's administration as Secretary of War. Before that, he had been governor of the Philippines, which was an American possession at that time. Taft seems to have never truly wanted to be president. His dream job was actually to serve as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. But Taft and Roosevelt were close allies, good friends, and fellow progressives, and the outgoing president chose Taft to carry on his policies and follow in his footsteps. Taft ran against 3-time Democratic nominee William Jennings Bryan. Even as a candidate, Taft had difficulty escaping from under TR's shadow. Political cartoons like these basically portrayed the Republican nominee as Roosevelt's sidekick. In one, Taft is the little prince hoisted high on King Theodore's shoulder, and in the other, he's dressed as a maid, as if taking care of Roosevelt's house and baby, his policies, while the real president is away. But Taft won the election easily, 321 electoral votes to Bryan's 162. Once in office, the new president couldn't help but seem to many people like Roosevelt light. He was a mild man who wasn't charismatic and wasn't a natural politician. Unlike TR, who had thrived on media coverage, Taft disliked interviews and photo opportunities. His presidency would be a disappointment to Roosevelt, to many progressives, and ultimately to Taft himself. You can click on the image to learn more. Theodore Roosevelt was a tough act to follow. TR had been a very active progressive, maybe the most purely active president in American history. He had used the platform of the presidency, what he called the bully pulpit, to focus the public's attention on matters that he felt needed reform. Taft was also a progressive, but of a milder sort. He wasn't comfortable using the bully pulpit to speak to the nation and tell Americans what to do and how to think. Some Republicans were relieved at this. In Taft, they felt they had a president who was a more traditional party leader, as well as less of a loose cannon. Mostly they were right. Without Roosevelt's partnership, Taft often relied on the conservatives and not the progressives in his party. Early in his presidency, Taft found himself at the center of a controversy over the tariff. Tariffs are the protective taxes a nation places on imported goods. To put it simply, higher tariffs generally favored big business, while lower tariffs generally favored consumers and smaller businesses. When Taft took office, tariffs were quite high, the traditional Republican position, and had been for a long time. Progressives in both parties, however, wanted a reduced tariff. Even Roosevelt had felt the tariffs needed to be lowered, but he had been clever enough to avoid dealing with the issue while in office. It was a political hot potato. Bravely, the new president called a special session of Congress to adjust and presumably reduce the tariff. The tariff bill Congress drafted did reduce rates, but later amendments to it actually raised them in some areas. But instead of vetoing the bill or fighting harder for a lower rate, Taft signed what became known as the Payne-Aldrich tariff. Immediately, some progressives called him a sellout. Taft then angered another group of progressives, conservationists. Roosevelt had made conservation the centerpiece of his presidency, but Taft was quick to replace TR's Interior Secretary, the cabinet minister who controls public lands, with his own pick, Richard Ballinger. Ballinger proceeded to unprotect some parcels of Western lands because he believed, not without reason, that TR had improperly preserved them. He also became involved in a minor scandal over coal mining claims that led some to view him as corrupt. For this, Ballinger was publicly criticized by Gifford Pinchot, the head of the U.S. Forest Service and one of Roosevelt's strongest progressive allies. Since Ballinger was Pinchot's boss, Taft felt he had no choice but to fire Pinchot for insubordination, which he did. But in fact, Gifford Pinchot had wanted to be fired in order to make a point. He went straight to Theodore Roosevelt to complain about President Taft. In one area, trust-busting, Taft was truly a strong progressive, going even further than the great trust-buster himself, Theodore Roosevelt, had done. He used the Sherman Antitrust Act to file lawsuits against 70 trusts, almost twice as many as TR had, in half the time. One of the trusts targeted by Taft was J.P. Morgan's massive U.S. Steel Company. This proved to be an embarrassment for TR, who had actually allowed U.S. Steel to expand while he had been president. In anger, Roosevelt actually accused Taft of being too harsh on the trusts, breaking them up when regulating them would be more appropriate. He criticized Taft for not being able to tell the difference between good and bad trusts. The ex-president had generally avoided the spotlight and stayed out of Taft's way since leaving the White House. But that was about to change. By the end of 1911, Theodore Roosevelt had become openly critical of President Taft and spoke of running for re-election himself. TR explained, "I'm really sorry for Taft. I am sure he means well, but he means well feebly, and he does not know how. He is utterly unfit for leadership, and this is a time when we need leadership." They were harsh words for the man he had hand-picked to follow in his footsteps. In February 1912, Roosevelt officially announced that he would challenge Taft for the Republican nomination in that year's presidential election. "My hat is in the ring," he declared. But although he was not fond of being president, Taft was unwilling to yield the office in so embarrassing a fashion. He was also determined to win the Republican nomination. The division between Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican Party in two. The ex-president represented the more progressive wing of his party, and the current president represented the more conservative wing. In the primary elections, Roosevelt won far more delegates than Taft did, but when the Republicans met in Chicago to choose their candidate, Taft was voted the nominee. Republican Party leaders preferred the more conservative, controllable Taft to Roosevelt, who, despite his popularity and past success, was still perceived as a loose cannon. Roosevelt and his supporters were outraged. Fistfights broke out on the convention floor. Within weeks, TR and other Republicans had formed the brand new Progressive Party and nominated Theodore Roosevelt for president. This division presented an opportunity for the Democratic Party. The Democrats had spent 50 years mostly in the political wilderness ever since the Civil War. In that long span of time, only one Democrat, Grover Cleveland, had been elected president. The Democrats nominated Woodrow Wilson, governor of New Jersey. In the 1912 election, all three major candidates, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, claimed to be the true progressive in the race. It was a testament to the progressive movement that its ideas had gone totally mainstream, spanning both parties and offering voters several versions of what progressivism actually meant. It soon became apparent that the 1912 election would be one of the most unusual and significant in American history. It actually featured four major candidates: Wilson the Democrat, Taft the Republican, Roosevelt the Progressive, and Eugene Debs, the Socialist candidate. The Socialist Party existed mostly on the fringes of American politics, but it would have its greatest influence in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Debs, a Union leader and a prominent socialist, had actually run for president 3 previous times, in 1900, 1904, and 1908. The Socialists had averaged about 3% of the popular vote in these elections. The real race in 1912 was between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. After TR told voters he felt as strong as a bull moose, his new Progressive Party had a nickname. His Bull Moose Party adopted a number of ideas that progressives and populists had been urging for decades: votes for women, the direct election of U.S. senators, a minimum wage, an end to child labor, and a federal income tax. The party's platform was nicknamed the New Nationalism. In almost every sense, the Roosevelt of 1912 was an even more radical progressive for his time than he had been as president just 4 years earlier. Wilson called his democratic vision for progressivism the New Freedom. He promised to attack what he called the triple wall of privilege: the tariffs, the banks, and the trusts. But Wilson stressed states' rights and limited government in a way that Roosevelt's New Nationalism did not. President Taft's milder version of progressivism seemed to get lost in the shuffle. And socialist Eugene Debs, for his part, called the Democrats, Republicans, and progressives all the tools of Wall Street and the enemies of the common man. In the end, Woodrow Wilson won the election. If the Republican Party had remained united with either Roosevelt or Taft as its nominee, either would have probably defeated Wilson. But with the Republican vote split in most states, Wilson dominated the Electoral College. This map shows the previous election of 1908 in which Taft was elected president. It's a fairly typical electoral map of this era. The Republican won most of the states of the North, Midwest, and West, seen here in red, and the Democrat won mostly the southern states, as seen here in blue. Compare it to this dramatically different map of 1912. Taft, the Republican, won only 2 small states, Vermont and Utah. Roosevelt, the Progressive, won several states of his own, seen here in green, but it remains the best performance by a third-party candidate in all of American history. But Wilson, the Democrat, swept the rest of the nation, winning 435 electoral votes. Eugene Debs won no states, but the Socialist Party got about 6% of the vote, its highest total ever.